talk with you today and share with you some of my work on the connections between race, religion, and Black Lives Matter. But before I get into the data and the study itself, I'd like to talk to you a bit about why I'm interested generally in this question about how religion may inform my ideas about social justice in a broader sense. All right, so let's go back a bit in time. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I attended Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Bethel is an AME church located on the northern end of the University of Michigan's campus. And at Bethel, I often attended worship services and special programs that reminded us that our faith in God is what delivered our people from a long history of racial oppression. And because of this, I just always assumed that religion would play a role in helping individuals and groups to cope with and to overcome hardship. So for example, every Black History Month in February, we had church programs that highlighted African American contributions to sports, politics, law, business, and all other areas of qualities of life in the US and across the globe. And of course, every annual Martin Luther King Day celebration, we learned about the Black church's role in the civil rights movement, including the role that some of our members played in the civil rights movement. Every election, I don't think that my church was alone in this, but every election, we had candidates that would come through and encourage us to vote, and some of these candidates were our church members, and they would encourage us to vote the right way without getting in trouble with the IRS, But as a teen, in 1993, I remember having discussions in our church basement about the Rodney King beating. I remember that. I remember having discussions about this beating that occurred, that everyone was able to see on national television. And we talked about the role of police in society, and we talked about what the protest meant and the civil unrest that followed. And obviously we had plays. At Bethel. This is me, precocious 13-year-old in 1989, getting ready for the Easter play of 1989, and that's my brother, Couture. I'm still, I'll share this with you guys. I'm still a little bummed out that I didn't get the role of Jesus in '89. And the thing that bothers me the most is that my mom was the director, and she picked Ronald Ampey over me for the part. But she said he was a better Jesus, so I'm over it. I still talk to my mom about this, so it's fine. The point of all this is that our church gave us a sense of self-worth. That's the idea here. In Sunday school and in the drama ministry, we learned that stories of liberation. I'm having a party somewhere. Okay. Y'all can attend too, it's fine. In Sunday school and in the drama ministry, we learned that the stories of liberation written about in the Bible were our stories too. Now, as a junior faculty member at Wayne State between the years of '05 and 2010, I attended Central United Methodist Church. And Central is an interracial church located downtown Detroit. And it has a long history of human rights activism. So, every human rights campaign you can possibly think of, 20th century into now, they were involved in. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, they actually invited King to pastor the church in '63, but apparently he had other things going on, so he couldn't take the job, '63. But they've also been involved in immigrant rights campaigns, anti-poverty efforts, anti-war efforts, you name it, they were involved. This picture gives an example of what I'm talking about. This is a 2016 picture. This is a picture of a 2016 press conference at the church in December of 2016, in which the pastor, Jill Zundell, announced the church's affirmative vote to house an Albanian family seeking asylum in Detroit. I'm not gonna get the name right, one Bargage family, Dead and Flora, were seeking asylum, and before the case was adjudicated, they sought refuge at Central, and the church voted to provide them with sanctuary. I say all this to make the point that my formative experiences in politically and theologically progressive worship spaces, both African American and multiracial, strongly shaped my research interest. And it is these experiences that shape the approach that I'm taking to this talk this afternoon. In the 4+ months following Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, Americans marched in over 4,000 cities to protest the police killings of unarmed African American men. Like other human rights campaigns of this nation's past, religious groups were also present in these demonstrations. So for example, on June 4th, 2020, people of faith marched with hundreds of others in downtown Detroit to demand an end to police brutality. The march began with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders praying for guidance. And it ended with these same religious leaders and elected officials calling legislators to support policies aimed at reducing police violence. They also urged marchers to vote their conscience in the November 2020 presidential election. At the march, Rabbi Asher Lopatin of Khalid Ed Shahim Synagogue of Huntington Woods, Michigan, a Detroit suburb, stated the following: "We should not just talk the talk, we should also walk the walk. All clergy have an impact and influence on the congregants, and we have to use that to make a difference." It's an interesting point, and I hope he's correct, but is he? Do some religious beliefs talk and walk align with racial justice work? And do clergy have an impact and influence on their congregants? I attempt to address these assertions by the rabbi by asking two questions, examining two questions. One, how do religious beliefs and clergy race talk associate with support for Black Lives Matter and racial justice work? And two, is the relationship between religion and Black Lives Matter similar or different across race groups? Examining how race may impact the relationship between religion and Black Lives Matter has both practical and theoretical implications. On a practical level, over the past 60 years, African Americans and Hispanics have made enormous gains in educational attainment, occupational prestige, political representation, and nearly all other areas of qualities of life in this country. But at the same time, racial hierarchies in political power and access to economic opportunities still exist. African Americans, followed by Hispanics, remain on the bottom of nearly all quality of life indicators, from poverty to incarceration, to being victimized by violence, to succumbing to COVID at the very early stages of the pandemic. And in part because of the electoral gerrymandering of our congressional districts and residential racial segregation, elected officials representing African Americans and Hispanics have a more difficult time passing legislation to address their concerns. The continued salience of these racial hierarchies means that racial minority-initiated movements, both faith-based and otherwise, are very likely to need the support of dominant groups to achieve their goals. This study is theoretically important because it should enhance our understanding about how religion may heighten and or reinforce support for movements like Black Lives Matter aimed at chipping away at this nation's racial hierarchy. All right, so this is all good. All right, so theoretical, practical implications, that's all good and well. But do we need another study on this topic? I'll say yeah. Yeah, I think we do. I say yeah, and not just because I want to get this paper published. I do. But there are other reasons. For one, much of what we know about the connection between these two constructs, religion and Black Lives Matter specifically, are based upon news reports. And nearly all the studies on the topic are based upon local ethnographies. Now, I know we have a lot of humanities scholars in the room, and I'm not taking jabs at you, I'm not at all. I'm just, because I want to make the point that these studies that use ethnographic approaches, they do a phenomenal job describing the theological motivation of activists as well as how prayer, sacred text, religious songs, stories, and spirituality frame the movement for and empower activists. These studies are also exceptional in describing the mobilization potential of religious congregations, as well as the many other ways religion enhances racial justice work. The best book I've read on this topic is Ferguson and Faith by Leah Gunning Francis, a theologian. And in her study, she interviewed and observed 24 faith leaders and 14 youth leaders that participated in the 2013 Ferguson Black Lives Matter protests. Now, as informative and brilliant as Francis' work is, and it is brilliant, and much of the work that relies upon ethnographic studies to look at this connection between religion and Black Lives Matter, as informative as it is, these types of studies are just not designed to tell us the percentage, for example, of Ferguson worship-goers that heard sermons about race or policing in their houses of worship. That's not their design. They're also not designed to tell us if the individuals that attended these types of congregations are more or less likely to support those types of protests or to actually get involved. And again, this is not a slight on qualitative-based work, and it's definitely not a slight on Francis's work. It's great. If you want to know more about the role that religious congregations played in Ferguson in mobilizing and inspiring activism, I suggest that you pick up that book and put it on your reading list. I'm just making the point that I'm sure all of us know in this room that ethnographic studies are not aimed at making broad population-based generalizations. That is the aim of survey-based research, which I employ to examine the connection between race, religion, and Black Lives Matter. And by using this approach, I hope to help organizers and scholars better understand how religious bodies may heighten support for racial justice movements and or attract those that already support them. Let's get a sip of water here. I'm sure that many of us already have a working knowledge of the history of Black Lives Matter, but I'd still like to discuss some of the events that led up to most Americans becoming aware of the national organization. Patrisse Cullors created the Black Lives Matter hashtag in 2013, following a Sanford, Florida jury acquitting George Zimmerman, a neighborhood patrol person, from killing Trayvon Martin. A year later, Cullors and other Black Lives Matter activists helped organize protests in Ferguson following Officer Darren Wilson killing Michael Brown. Wilson killed Brown after confronting him about allegedly shoplifting from a local store. It was at these protests that the Black Lives Matter slogan began gaining mainstream social media attention. In 2020, public awareness of Black Lives Matter reaches height following Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd. Chauvin killed Floyd after confronting him about allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill. As stated earlier, this event was followed by protests and civil unrest occurring in over 4,000 American cities, as well as across the world. That year, the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation received $90 million in donations, and their local chapters continued to grow. Now, in addition to engaging in movement politics, the BLM Foundation also engages in lobbying and electoral politics work. In the month leading up to and following Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter Foundation lobbied Congress to support the BREATHE Act. This act calls the federal government to reduce funding to state and local governments for police armaments, so to increase funding for mental health, public education, job training, and other programs aimed at increasing human capital. Along these lines, the Black Lives Matter Foundation created a political action committee to support candidates that support their policy goals. During the 2020 presidential campaign season, they participated in voter registration drives, and they also helped organize issue education forums. Patrisse Cullors, BLM co-founder, argued that religious rituals and spirituality provided activists such as herself with the strength to do the type of work that I just spoke of. The salience of ritual and spirituality to Black Lives Matter activism was on full display at a virtual religious service held at UCLA's Fowler Museum on June 13, 2020. At the service, she shredded sheets of paper written with the written words, police and white racism, while the recorded prayer from Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd played on repeat. In describing the political salience of the ritual, Kalura stated, "It's literally almost resurrecting a spirit so they can work through us to get the work that we need to get done." So, over the past 60 years, what we find in survey research is that between 40 and 50% of American worship-goers, about 40 to 50% of worship-goers attend worship services that are in some ways not too different from this UCLA virtual service, where clergy are encouraging congregants to think about and discuss race and racism. Unlike the UCLA service, however, when most clergy talk about race or other political issues, they tend not to take a very clear position on those issues. Most actually take neutral positions on issues. And so what you get in survey research is that when you ask individuals if they heard a sermon about a political issue, including race, those that say, yeah, I heard discussion about race, they generally say that my clergy member did not take a position. 70% said the clergy did not take a clear position on race as well as other issues. However, when they do take clear positions, when individuals say that their clergy do take clear positions on issues such as race, what you generally get, that respondents are saying that their clergy tend to align themselves with the racial justice position. Let me just give you two examples from two surveys 60 years apart. So in 1961, in the height of the freedom rides, with African Americans and whites that stood in solidarity with African Americans were testing the segregation laws in the South, Protho and Stiff, two American political scientists, fielded a survey in the American South, in which they asked individuals a bunch of questions about the civil rights movement, about politics, about religion. And with the religion question, this is how they asked the question that got at whether or not you would say that your clergy supported or opposed racial integration. So they asked individuals how often they attend worship services. And so if individuals said they attend at least once a month, they asked them, well, did you hear a sermon at least once over the course of the year about racial integration? And if they said yes, they said, okay, well, what position do you think that your clergy took? And what you get is that those individuals that said that their clergy took a clear position, they were considerably more likely to say that their clergy favored racial integration than opposed racial integration. 60 years later, at the height of the Black Lives Matter protest in June of 2020, researchers at the Pew Research Center asked a very similar question. They asked respondents, how often do you attend? If you said, I attend at least once a month, did you hear a sermon about Black Lives Matter at least once, either virtually or in person? And if they said yes, they said, okay, well, what did you hear? And what you get in this survey is fairly similar to what you found in 1961, that individuals were more likely to say that their clergy supported Black Lives Matter and take a clear position on it than said that they opposed Black Lives Matter. And we can talk more about these surveys during the Q&A if you're interested. Clergy that preach sermons about race in terms of talking about racial segregation in the 1960s or talking about Black Lives Matter today, clergy that take these issues up, they tend to emphasize a social justice-oriented faith that calls the listener to stand in solidarity with the poor, the powerless, and the oppressed. This type of theology frames faithfulness as a commitment to doing God's will of enhancing human flourishing and ending human suffering. From this perspective, loving the Creator involves feeding the hungry, visiting political prisoners, caring for the immigrant and or refugee, and standing and acting in solidarity with marginalized groups. These ideals are consistent with the religious left's view that leaders of powerful institutions can be sinful, And consequently, because they can be sinful, the faithful are called to root out sin in those institutions, so to move the nation in greater alignment with God's will. This articulation of this idea of a social justice-oriented belief system is well articulated in Reverend Nelson Jerome Pierce's statement about his view about what it meant to be involved in the Black Lives Matter protest. He states, "I have become increasingly convinced that, at least for me, I cannot be a Christian if I am not actively engaged in the dismantling of oppression where I live and helping dismantle oppression around the world." This is part of what it means to me to be a follower of Christ. The point of this is that what you will likely find is that individuals that believe in a social justice-oriented religion and identify with the religious left, these folks are likely more supportive and involved in Black Lives Matter related activities than individuals that do not hold this religious belief system and identity. In addition to theology, as Rabbi Loperton stated a few moments ago, as I quoted Rabbi Loperton a few moments ago, one's clergy may also play a role in how persons think about race. Clergy are capable of influencing theological and political thinking via sermons because, one, they have a captive audience. At least once a week for many religious traditions, congregants attend worship services in which the clergy are the key speaker. And two, these congregants tend to believe, in a general sense, that their clergy are experts, or at least have a handle in interpreting and applying sacred texts to their personal and political lives. And in some religious traditions, what you get is that the senior clergy or an associate clergy or lay leaders lead weekly studies of their sacred text outside of worship services. And three, during their sermons, adroit clergy are able to infer sacred meaning from seemingly profane experiences. And Reverend Sean Ellison's accounting of how he experienced the Black Lives Matter protest in 2013 makes this case. He stated that his marching in the rain during the 2013 Ferguson protest was a collective baptism that awakened him and others to their racial justice mission. Now, congregants of congregations led by individuals such as Reverend Jones tend to be open to these types of messages and interpretations because many genuinely love their clergy and their fellow congregants with whom they worship. And because of this love, many trust that their clergy has their best spiritual and temporal interest at heart. And because it's a free country and you don't have to attend, you don't have to put money in the bucket, if you don't like what you're hearing, you don't like the interpretation, people can and do leave. Now, as I'm sure we're very aware, as it does for nearly all other experiences in this country, race also likely impacts this connection between religion and Black Lives Matter. And it may seem counterintuitive here, but my argument is this, that religion may more strongly associate with support for Black Lives Matter among whites than is the case for African Americans and Hispanics. And just hear me out here. This may be the case because for some whites, racial justice is a theological or philosophical question about one's ethical obligation to share power. As the group that economically, politically, and culturally benefits the most from their position in this nation's racial hierarchy, racial justice is fundamentally about sacrifice. For some of these individuals that are contemplating this type of sacrifice, it often involves grappling with questions like, what does it mean to be faithful? What does it mean to be a good human? And what does it mean to be a good citizen amidst countervailing human impulses and political pressures that encourages one to do otherwise? On the other hand, because African Americans and Hispanics lack the political power and the economic resources to improve the relatively disadvantaged position, it's likely the case that racial justice for these groups is less of a theological question than a practical one. This is put simply. Whites that attend worship settings that discuss racial minorities as the brother and sister as opposed to the other are likely very different in their racial attitudes and views about Black Lives Matter than do whites that do not attend these types of worship spaces. On the other hand, for African Americans and Hispanics, it's likely the case that those inside and outside of racial justice worship spaces both see racial minorities as a brother and sister and to subsequently support Black Lives Matter. This is likely the case because for racial minorities, it is in their individual and group interest to see the world in this manner. For this reason, I am making a case that religion may more strongly associate with white support for Black Lives Matter than it does for Blacks and Hispanics. And this leads to my two hypotheses here. One, individuals, they hear Black Lives Matter related sermons and hold progressive religious ideals are more likely to support Black Lives Matter and to participate in protest activism and racial uplift work. I'll talk about what I'm talking about in a moment here. Secondly, religion may more strongly associate with white Black Lives Matter attitudes and activism than it does for African Americans and Hispanics. To test my hypotheses, I'm relying upon the National Politics Study. This is a national survey of roughly 6,000 Americans that ask individuals questions about race and racism, religion, social movements, political activism. We also ask people a bunch of questions about COVID and health in a more general sense. And as you can see, there's roughly an equal number of African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites in the study. We conducted this survey, as you can see, between October 1, 2020 and January 13, 2021. So we entered the field about a month before the 2020 presidential election, and we exited the field about a week after the January 6th insurrection. I also ran the same analysis on Pew Research Center data, but I'm not going to go over that right now, but if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it because I have it, but please ask me about it because I have it. But all right, so this is my analysis strategy. So I'm going to present the background analysis first, and then the main analysis. All right. So in the background analysis, what I'm doing is I'm looking first at the impact of race on support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm looking at the impact of race on individuals' involvement in protest and racial justice work. And this is a measure that asks individuals if in the past 12 months you've been involved in an organization aimed at improving the quality of life of racial minorities. That's the survey question. I'm also looking at the impact of race on the degree to which individuals hear sermons about race and racism and about policing. I also look at the impact of race on the degree to which individuals say that social justice is a core component of their religious belief system, and the degree to which individuals say they identify with the religious left. Those are the background analyses. And the main analysis what I'm doing is I'm looking at the impact of race. I'm looking at racial differences in the relationship between my religion measures and my Black Lives Matter measures. That's the approach here. Okay, so first, let's take a look at this connection between race and Black Lives Matter attitudes and related activism. So in this figure right here, we're looking at race differences in approval of Black Lives Matter. The survey question is, to what degree do you approve of Black Lives Matter? Not at all, to strongly approve. So we're looking at individuals that said they approve of Black Lives Matter. We're also looking at race differences here in the degree to which individuals characterize the demonstrations following Floyd's death as a legitimate form of protest or as lawlessness or something else. So these are individuals that said that the demonstrations were a legitimate form of protest. And we also looked at the race differences in the degree to which individuals stated that they participated in at least one protest over the past 12 months, and race differences in the degree to which individuals said they were involved in a racial uplift organization in the past 12 months. So, when looking at the attitude questions, we find a similar pattern of relationships. African Americans were most likely to say they approved of Black Lives Matter, followed by Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites. We also find that African Americans were most likely to characterize the demonstrations as a legitimate form of protest, followed by Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites. When it comes to civic activism, we find a slightly different pattern of relationships. We find that African Americans and non-Hispanic whites were equally likely, statistically, to say that they have participated in at least one protest in the past 12 months. Hispanics were less likely than non-Hispanic whites to say that they had engaged in this type of political activism. And we also find a similar relationship when looking at involvement in racial uplift organizations. African Americans and whites are statistically equal in their likelihood of saying they participated in that type of organization, and Hispanics were less likely than non-Hispanic whites to say that they had done so. So, what we know so far is that race matters for Black Lives Matter attitudes and civic activism. African Americans were more or as likely as Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites to support the goals of Black Lives Matter, to characterize the demonstrations as a legitimate form of protest, and to engage in protest activism and racial uplift work. Okay. Let's take a look at the relationship between race and my religion measures. In this figure right here, we're looking at race differences in the degree to which individuals stated that they heard a sermon about race relations, virtually or in person, at least one time over the past 12 months. We're also looking at racial differences in the degree to which individuals stated they heard a sermon about policing at least one time in the past 12 months. And again, these are individuals that stated that they attended worship services at least once a month. So what we find here is that African Americans and non-Hispanic whites were statistically as likely as one another to say they heard a sermon about race. And Hispanics were less likely than both groups to say that they had heard the type of a sermon. Similarly, African Americans and non-Hispanic whites were equally likely to say they heard a sermon about policing over the past 12 months. And again, Hispanics were less likely than both groups to say that they had heard such a sermon. In this figure right here, we're looking at race differences and the degree to which individuals stated they identify with the religious left, and the degree to which individuals stated that social justice is core to their religious beliefs. These are individuals that stated that they affiliated with an organized religion. So if somebody said that they were secular or an atheist or agnostic, we did not ask them this question. These are only individuals that stated that they affiliated with an organized religion. So what we have here is that African Americans and Hispanics were both more likely than non-Hispanic whites to say that they identified with the religious left. However, we find a slightly different pattern of relationships when we're looking at the degree to which individuals stated they believe social justice is core to their religious beliefs. Here, what we find is that African Americans and non-Hispanic whites were equally likely to say that they held this belief system, and Hispanics were less likely than African Americans to say that they held this belief system. But as you can see, a majority of all three groups stated that they held this belief system. So this is what we have so far. Race matters for religion as well. African Americans were more or as likely as Hispanics and whites to, one, hear sermons relevant to Black Lives Matter, and two, to identify with and believe in progressive religious ideals. All right, so this is why you guys asked me to come and talk about this. So let's get to the main course here. Let's take a look at race differences in this association between religion and Black Lives Matter attitudes and activism. All right. Can you guys see these? Can you see this? All right, okay. This right here is a table of probability estimates or adjusted percentages. And probability estimates are the likelihood that someone said that they approved of the goals of Black Lives Matter by the degree to which they heard a sermon about race and policing, identified with the religious left or not, and the degree to which they stated social justice is core to their religious belief. All right, so we're looking at the relationship between these religion measures and support for Black Lives Matter among African Americans, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic whites. Now, these probability estimates are based upon logit regression multivariate analyses, and in those analyses, what we did is that we controlled for a number of social demographic, religious, and political partisan variables. So we take into account for demographics, age, gender, the standard, age, gender, education, region, marital status, if they're employed or not, we take that into account. So we're holding those demographic characteristics constant. We also take into account religious affiliation. So if people are identified with any one of the Christian denominations, as well as if they identify as Jewish, Muslim, Hindi, Buddhist, if they identify as non-religious, we take that into account. We also take into account political partisanship, if people are Republican, Democrat, or Independent. So assuming that the individuals statistically are constant on these characteristics, assuming we hold these characteristics constant, the question is, what's the independent relationship of these religion measures on approval of Black Lives Matter? And what we find is that there's a relationship. There's an association between the two. So what we find here is that among all three racial groups that we looked at, individuals that stated that they heard a sermon about race and policing were more likely than individuals that said that they attended but they didn't hear a sermon about race and policing, and more likely than individuals that said they did not attend at all. They were more likely to say that they approved of Black Lives Matter, okay? And we find that among African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. What we also find is that the relationship that we observed among non-Hispanic whites is statistically stronger than the relationship that we observed among Hispanics and African Americans. This is not to suggest that there's not a relationship. There is a relationship among all three groups, but the relationship is statistically stronger among non-Hispanic whites. I didn't include the confident intervals, but trust me, there's an interaction there. What we also find is that individuals that identify with the religious left are more likely than individuals that identify with the religious right or another religious identity to say that they supported Black Lives Matter. That is the case among African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. And finally, similar story. Those respondents that stated that social justice was core to their religious belief were more likely than respondents that said it wasn't to support Black Lives Matter. Again, we find this relationship among African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. In this table right here, we employ very similar, identical analysis strategy. And here we're looking at the relationship between the religion variables and the degree to which individuals stated that the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were a legitimate form of protest as opposed to lawlessness, all right? And so again, what we find here is that individuals that stated that they heard a sermon about race and policing were more likely to say that these demonstrations were a legitimate form of protest. We find that among African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. Again, just as we found in the previous analyses, this relationship is statistically stronger among non-Hispanic whites than it is among Hispanics and African Americans. We also find that individuals that identify with the religious left are more likely to say that the demonstrations were a legitimate form of protest for all three racial groups. We find that to be the case. And we also find that individuals that said that social justice is core to their religious beliefs were more likely to characterize these demonstrations as a legitimate form of protest. We find this to be the case among African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic whites. Again, we find that this relationship is statistically stronger among non-Hispanic whites than it is among the other two race groups that we examined. This last table. It's the same story here. In this table right here, we're looking at the correlation, the association between my religion variables and the degree to which individuals stated they participated in a protest and or a racial uplift organization at least one time over the past 12 months. And again, what we find here is that we find a connection between hearing sermons about race and policing and being involved in this form of civic activism. For all three groups, we find that those individuals that attend worship settings in which they hear sermons about race and policing to be more likely than others to say that they participated in this form of civic activism. And we find this to be the case for the three groups that we examined. We're looking at the correlation between identifying with the religious left. Actually, these numbers are a little bit off here. No, that's not. We're looking at identification with the religious left. We find for African Americans and Hispanics, those that identify with the religious left were more likely to say that they participated in protests and or a racial uplift organization. We did not find a relationship among non-Hispanic whites for this question. Finally, again, we find that those individuals, those respondents that stated that social justice was core to their religious beliefs, they were more likely than those that stated that it was not to say that they participated in a protest or a racial uplift organization. This was the case for all three groups. Again, this relationship is statistically stronger for non-Hispanic whites than for Hispanics and African Americans. So, race matters to the relationship between religion and Black Lives Matter attitudes and civic activism. For each race group, exposure to Black Lives Matter related sermons and progressive religion associates with support for Black Lives Matter, as well as involvement in protest, activism, and or racial uplift work. Our central finding is that these forms of religion tend to maintain a stronger relationship with white Black Lives Matter attitudes and activism than it does for African Americans and Hispanics. We'll talk about that later. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, for me, it means that Rabbi Asher Lopatin is right. That's what it means to me. Worship settings and religious beliefs maintain the potential to mobilize Americans for racial justice work. This is true for all race groups, but perhaps particularly so of non-Hispanic whites. One way to understand these findings is that awareness of racial inequalities and access to political power and economic resources leads some whites to view racial justice as a theological quandary. Whites that attend congregations where they are challenged to live out a faith that requires sacrifice for human rights and also generally adhere to these ideals, they seemingly take a very different approach to racial justice than do other whites. In contrast, racial justice may be less of a theological than a practical necessity for racial groups that suffer from racial discrimination. This is likely the case because regardless of whether or not African Americans and Hispanics hear sermons about race or identify with the religious left, many recognize that police violence is a serious problem and they don't want to fall victim to it, and they don't want their family members and others to fall victim to it either. This may help explain why religion does not as strongly correlate with Black Lives Matter support among African Americans and Hispanics as it does for non-Hispanic whites. All right, okay, that's good, but who cares? So what? Well, I would say that anyone concerned about racial justice should take heart in our finding that the potential exists for attendees of progressive worship spaces to discuss race in a manner that heightens or reinforces a commitment to racial equality. And the fact that this potential may be strongest among whites should be encouraging to racial justice advocates because political leaders are particularly concerned about their policy platforms resonating with this group. Notwithstanding, there are challenges to these types of congregations realizing their potential to do racial justice work. For one, worship attendance and religious identification is on the decline, which speaks to the political relevance, or perhaps the declining political relevance of faith-based activists. And there are other challenges. For one, racial justice work has the potential to alienate white congregants and or limit their ability to attract others. Some scholars argue that the civil rights work of white mainline Protestant and Catholic churches during the 1950s and 1960s contributed to those religious groups losing members and financial strength in subsequent decades. And today, among white congregations, what you find is that theologically liberal congregations have fewer regular attendees than theologically moderate and conservative congregations. In addition, the fact that Black Lives Matter can point to few legislative victories, it may contribute to burnout and discouragement among some activists. For example, in 2020, the Democratic National Convention did not add the BREATHE Act to their party platform. And it's also unclear if Black Lives Matter's activism has had any direct impact on reducing police violence against African Americans. But all is not lost. I would say all is not lost. I would say don't take this kind of nihilistic determinist approach. It's not the end of the world. And I say this because prophetic religious people and organizations will likely continue the human rights work because they tend not to judge the outcome of their activism in temporal terms. From their perspective, one's individual life extends beyond the physical life. Now, this is a contrary worldview to rational empiricist thought that would suggest that activists just give up in lieu of their activism yielding few or no legislative victories or quality of life changes in the here and now. However, activists that believe in a higher power that works through them to bend the moral arc of the universe towards racial justice even slightly, they likely are sustained in their belief that their activism has meaning. Thank you.